Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first in a series of talks on Alfred Russel Wallace. I'm delighted that so many of you are here today. What we're doing in the series is starting off with Kathleen Lowrey from the Department of Anthropology. I will follow on next week. I'm Robert Smith in the Department of History and Classics, and then we have three outside speakers. And if you've seen the posters we put around or looked on Art Town Cry, you'll have seen who they are. But if anybody isn't aware of the full list of speakers, and we have 5 people coming on Wednesday afternoons throughout October, I've got a few extra flyers here. So if you'd like to pass them along, if you've already seen details, and if you haven't, please grab one. And if you'd like to post these nice orange or pink announcements on your department bulletin board, feel free. So the series is being supported by SHIRK through a cluster grant, and the University of Alberta is one of the nodes, to use a SHIRK term, one of the nodes in a national cluster grant. And we're, in fact, in the last year of this cluster grant. But if you go to the website for the cluster grant, you'll see many different lectures that have been recorded and put on there. There are lots of podcasts of those of you who maybe attended Evelyn Fox-Keller's talk in April. If you want to relive that, you can go to the website and see Evelyn's talk again. And I have a few brochures for the Situating Science Cluster Grant. The most important thing on the little brochure is it's got the address for the website. And there's, as I say, all sorts of stuff on there. So I will also pass these around for anybody who'd like to take one. So today we're going to start the series, and the series is called More Than Natural Selection, and the point of that is we want to try and capture in the series not just Wallace as an evolutionist and an advocate of natural selection, although that's clearly an important element in anything to do with Wallace, but we also want to look at Wallace from a range of different perspectives, to see Wallace in a way as a way to get into issues to do with Victorian science as well as Victorian culture. And the first of our speakers in the series is Kathleen Lowrey from the Department of Anthropology. She's an associate professor in the department, which she joined in 2005. She's carried out fieldwork in the Gran Chaco region of South America, and she's done the fieldwork since 1997. Her publications on the basis of that research, and I'm just reading what Kathleen has sent me, treat environmental conservation, the participation of indigenous peoples in political processes and in the market economy, lowland South American ethnohistory, witchcraft and shamanism. And her interest in Wallace dates back to, in fact, her high school years, which she spent living with a family in Jakarta in Indonesia. And so I think we'll probably hear about Wallace there, amongst other things. The title of Kathleen's talk is The Time Travellers, Alfred Russel Wallace and Peter Kropotkin. So over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for everyone for coming. I hope that people, I think that actually Wallace is one of those figures that there are a lot of secret Wallace enthusiasts, so I'm really pleased to see this, and I'm so delighted that we were not wrong, and so I hope the turnouts just grow and grow. Robert and I joked about the first 2 talks that maybe we would have 3 or 4 people in the room, and then eventually it would be terrific if we get just more and more people coming out for Wallace. I really wish I had picked a more neutral starting slide. I just didn't think about it, so this is sort of very making a powerful declamation. But what I am going to talk about today is 2 men who came out of the intellectual and political debates of the 19th century triumphant, though dead, and a lot about 2 who would be eclipsed in the aftermath of the 19th century. I titled my talk The Time Travelers because Wallace and Kropotkin are suddenly seemingly everywhere again a few years into the 21st century. Perhaps this was because, so there's, well, and I'll go back to these, so if you're it's funny, I draw a lot of contrast among these men, but what they all share is gigantic beards. The prize, and perhaps this is because Darwin and Marx won, but the 20th century really turned out to be no prize at all. And I spent a little bit of time when I was setting up the PowerPoint slides looking for, things that might illustrate the powers of the 20th century, and all of the images were actually too horrible. So instead I thought I would have this semi-ironic shiny gold font saying 20th century. So there's an irony here that while I, as the anthropologist, am doing time, next week Robert, the historian, will be doing space, one would expect the fields of expertise to be reversed. Anthropologists usually do space around the world. But at least Robert is a historian of space science. I'm really out of my field of direct competence here. In real life, I'm an ethnography of Guarani indigenous peoples of the South American Chaco. This means that I'll be very glad to hear corrections, critiques, challenges to what I say today. I do, though, at the outset want to make a strong assertion, even on what I admit to be an admittedly slender thread of authority, and that is that I don't take the view that the disasters of the 20th century were due to misguided apprehensions of Darwinism and Marxism. They were due to many things, but I actually think that there's little salvageable in Darwin's vision of evolution, and I'm among those who've become convinced that what's been worth paying attention to in Darwin was mostly plagiarized from Wallace anyway. Marxism I would handle differently, but for today I'm going to appear before you in my combined avatar of Darwin basher and Marx basher, which is a kind of ceremonial mask, which I recommend to anyone who has ever taken Darwin or Marx extremely seriously. My own undergraduate degree is in biology, and I completed my doctoral work in a milieu where one's grasp of Marx was taken very seriously, so I'm actually an apostate on both counts. My exposure to Wallace and to Kropotkin came from sources entirely external to my own formal education. My mother has been a Wallace enthusiast since we lived in Indonesia during the 1980s, and the present-day nation of Indonesia is treated in, includes many of the places described in Wallace's famous book, The Malay Archipelago. My mother has for decades been given to muttering dark imprecations about Darwin's perfidy, so I read Wallace and the literature on the delicate arrangement between Darwin and Wallace under her influence. Turning to Kropotkin, my first teaching job after I finished my doctorate was as a sabbatical replacement professor for an anthropologist on the faculty at Warren Wilson College. This is a very unusual institution of post-secondary education in the mountains of North Carolina. It's a work college, and what that means is that it's a very interesting model of how to run a college. It's a small liberal arts college at which students work at trades during their studies. They run the cafeteria, they run a working farm. One time my students took me to visit the pig farm, and oh god, the smell was so awful, I almost passed out. They become apprentice electricians, locksmiths, house painters, and the like. They do much of the janitorial and secretarial work on campus. Nowadays, many of the students come from quite affluent families, so it's kind of a place of affluent hippies. But it was founded, the intent was to civilize Appalachian yokels. And it still has as its core a real ethos of self-directed self-improvement. I have a very funny anecdote about Warren Wilson College, but in the interest of time, I want to keep this to under 45 minutes. I'm not going to tell it if you're curious. Later. In any event, I took over the teaching of the undergraduate Introduction to Social Theory course and did the standard Marx, Weber, Durkheim, a little dash of Freud. And my students asked me why I wasn't teaching Kropotkin. This was 2003, and so a decade ago. I didn't have a good answer at all. I mean, other than no one teaches Kropotkin, that's why I thought teaching me Kropotkin. And I actually had, as soon as I got the question, I realized I had only the feeblest of senses of who Kropotkin was. It turns out, once I did a little research at the time, that I had a composite character that was sort of one part Kropotkin, a little dash of Bakunin, a little bit of Proudhon, all tossed together into someone who is kind of a fuzzily recollected foil of Marx. But I began to notice that my students had been onto something as anarchism came up more and more often in popular culture and in scholarship across the decade to come, so between 2003 and now. Eventually I did figure out who Kropotkin was, and I read a little bit of Kropotkin and found him very, very interesting. So Wallace, let me go back to the pictures. Wallace was a natural scientist who took an expert and opinionated interest in politics. And I say expert because Wallace really went out of his way to inform himself about political and economic issues of his age. Kropotkin was a revolutionary who took an expert and opinionated interest in natural science. And actually, Kropotkin's first formation was as a scientist, so he wasn't just a dilettante. I'll talk about each of these men in detail further on, but in their science and in their politics, Wallace and Kropotkin both saw an important role for cooperation, where Marx and Darwin and their theories really emphasized competition. This distinction has been commented upon by others, and I'll discuss it today, but I doubt that I'll say anything really very new about it. Wallace and Kropotkin also both insisted on the inadequacy of exclusively materialist or utilitarian frameworks for understanding the human story. And this divergence from Marx and from Darwin has, in my view, received insufficient and misguided attention. Now, I want to make a caveat here, because when I say Darwin and Marx are materialists and utilitarians and Wallace and Kropotkin are not, I'm worried that some of you might be thinking, she said she went to high school in Indonesia, she has a connection to North Carolina, maybe she is the child of evangelical missionaries, and this story is headed as, a championing of Christian theology. That is not where I'm going to take you. I will, toward the end of the talk, suggest what I think is particularly exciting about these aspects of Wallace and Kropotkin. But first, I want to contextualize what I'm going to say in terms of the materialism and utilitarianism of Darwin and Marx. So let me go back to those first two images. Darwin's Origin of Species, Marx's Capital, and here I also just throw in, although this is not going to be my focus today, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. Those three books offered something tremendously novel to 19th century readers. An account of how things are that was devoid of supernatural agency, that was systematic, that was historical, and that posited a set of processes into which those same readers might actually be able to intervene. Nature, society, and morality, as known at any particular moment, were not fixed orders. They were emergent from systematic historical processes of struggle and competition that were explicable in secular terms, and which now, being understood as such, would surely be manipulable by human agents. Marx and Nietzsche suggested that willful manipulation, in fact, had long been underway in the generation of the known social and moral order. Darwin drew much of his evidence from livestock breeding and subscribed fully to the eugenic aims his cousin Francis Galton formulated upon the basis of his evolutionary theorizing. Okay, so the eugenics part, obviously the consequences of the implementation of those ideas were quite horrific during the 20th century. The implementation of Marx's ideas, well, that also had less than totally felicitous results. As many of you are no doubt aware, Nietzsche was also put to very unhappy purpose during the 20th century. None of that nullifies, and I do want to say this, none of that nullifies how liberating these understandings were in context of what had gone before, and how foundational they were to many of the happy stories of the 20th century as well. Movements for the rights of women, for decolonization, against racism. If the way things are has no divine mandate, but is instead a product of profane forces which might be directed in other ways, becomes well worth anyone's time, not simply to imagine a different sort of world, but to try and bring it into being. People in the 19th century, of course, had no notion of the horrors the 20th century would bring. And the 19th century was charged with a lively and delightful sense of optimism about possible futures. Indeed, Wallace called it the wonderful century in a book he wrote about the 19th century, which is not a label anyone can imagine attaching to the 20th. The late 19th century in particular fairly buzzed with reform movements of all kinds. And that word is kind of dead to us now in a way that it clearly wasn't then. The idea of reform is actively structuring and creating a new world, not reform in the sense of reform school, which is, I think, how we tend to hear it now. So Marxism, Darwinism, anarchism, spiritualism, feminism, anti-vivisectionism, Uranianism, abolitionism, Fabianism, many other isms were on the simultaneous bubble. It wasn't clear then which would emerge as the world shapers and which would be minor. If you spend a bit of time poking through the potsherds of this not-so-distant past, a little archaeological metaphor. And this is something that our keynote speaker is going to really talk about all these exciting isms of the late 19th century, Christine Ferguson, in the last week. But if you start poking through them, what's really astonishing is how many ideas we consider sort of new and jazzy ideas of our current moment. How many of them were already around in the late 19th century, but sort of didn't seem to flourish across the 20th century. And if you look with a 21st century gaze at who and what did flourish out of the 19th century and who and what didn't, it's difficult not to feel a little bit gimlet-eyed about the winners and the losers of that era. So I want to talk first about these winners. Here I may be repeating parallels others have noted, but they were new to me as I began noting them, and perhaps they will be to you as well. So Karl Marx and Charles Darwin shared a lot more than a first name, Charles and Karl. Neither really worked or spent much time as practical men during their adult lives. Darwin's famous Journey on the Beagle was over by the time he was 27. Marx earned some income from writing, but was principally supported by his collaborator Friedrich Engels for many years. Darwin's income came from his family, first his father, and later his wife. Both men were primarily theorizers, though Darwin did carry out some experimental work, and Marx was active as a political organizer. Both men married relatively young, Marx at 25 and Darwin at 30, interestingly enough to slightly older women. Jenny Marx was 4 years older than Karl. Emma Darwin was a year older than Charles. And in each case, they married women they had known since childhood. Both had large families. Marx had 7 children in his marriage, 1 child outside of marriage, which is another anecdote that I don't think I have time for, but if you're interested, I can tell an anecdote about that. Darwin had 10 children, and the role of patriarch was really important to both men. Neither lived to a great old age. Marx died at 65, and Darwin died at 73. Both were really quite misanthropic. Darwin had this system set up in his house so he could see who was at the door, so he didn't want to see that person, he could sort of hide between the there. Marx seemed to fight with everyone he collaborated with, except for Engels. He just had bitter battles with every single other leftist in Europe at the time. And both, I think I'll stop there because I don't want to really tell that Marx anecdote actually. Both were very sexist. And though Marx wasn't quite a racist, he failed in his theories to grasp just how important the colonies were to the functioning of the European capitalist system. This is actually something, this was Rosa Luxemburg's later contribution that she made as an amendment to Marx's theory. Darwin, I would say, was absolutely a racist, despite latter-day attempts to bathe him in a more charitable light. It's almost the full title of Darwin's magnum opus is almost never quoted in its entirety on the origin of species or the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life. And Darwin did draw exactly the conclusions one might imagine from that idea. I have argued elsewhere that it is in fact exactly the racism and their sexism that helped them win the battle of ideas at the turn of the 20th century. That it wasn't despite this, but because of this, that so many white and male thought leaders of the age embraced them over other possibilities. They both put European white men at the center of the story of life. They both constructed that story as a story of unrelenting competitive struggle. Okay, in each case, the two men, and of course they were also men, also with giant beards, Wallace and Kropotkin, who at the time framed things very differently, and who had at the time many admirers and tremendous influence, were not, ironically enough, vanquished in competitive struggle with Darwin and Marx. What happened instead was a kind of sneaky modality of cooperation in both cases. Both Wallace and Kropotkin, and to give a fair account of what happened, with their own consent and participation, were sort of co-opted to what became the Darwinian and Marxist predominances. The case of Wallace has received quite a lot of scholarly attention. The way in which the sort of arrangement by which Wallace's paper was presented at the same time that Darwin said, I have this idea that I've been working on for years and years, and Wallace sort of participated in his own eclipsing by Darwin. Kropotkin, for his part, is now, and actually I have to thank our this next one I have to thank the Appropriation So I have to thank our cameraman, Millie and Marvin, for that. I just think this is such a funny little cartoon. There's Darwin and there's Wallace. But Kropotkin, for his part, is commemorated in a Moscow metro stop, so this is Kropotkinskaya. And he was generally painted right into the Marxist pantheon by the Soviets, though in fact Kropotkin himself was scathingly critical of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and he really felt that the Russian Revolution had gone awry when it embraced German economic materialism and kind of abandoned, he talked about it, abandoning the Slavic soul. And I just want to make a tiny little bracketed subphrase here, which that, Kropotkin saying that, like the turn towards German economic materialism, the abandonment of the Slavic soul, that's often kind of code for a certain kind of anti-Semitism, especially in the Slavic context, but it doesn't seem to have been in Kropotkin's case. For revolutionary Russians like Kropotkin, Germany was a particular nemesis. The royal family, the Tsarist family, was German in origin since the time of Catherine the Great. It had introduced many Prussian innovations in its ruling policies over the 19th century, and like the Jewish Marx himself, Kropotkin took Germany to be the face of militaristic imperialist capitalism. But at any rate, the anti-materialist, anti-utilitarian concern with soul and spirit is something Kropotkin shared with Wallace, and indeed Wallace was a great admirer of Kropotkin. I don't actually know, I just haven't been able to find out if the reverse was the case, but I would really be interested to know more about it. So this seems to be, now I want to turn and do for Darwin and Marx what I just did I want to do for Wallace and Kropotkin what I just did for Darwin and Marx, because actually there's a lot of parallels between Wallace and Kropotkin, interestingly enough. At first blush, they don't seem obviously alike. So first of all, they're generationally, they're about 20 years apart, where Darwin and Marx are only about 10 years apart. They don't share a first name. And above all, Wallace's origins were rather humble, while Kropotkin was no fooling, a Russian prince. But Wallace himself said, and here I'm going to quote from, this is a speaker who's coming in a few weeks, Martin Fishman. He's written, if you're interested in Wallace, it's a wonderful biography of Wallace. But Wallace said when he read Kropotkin's memoirs, he said, Kropotkin's early life, its childhood I mean, allowing for immense difference of rank, wealth, and country, was in essentials, education, play, etc., not unlike my own, and affords another indication of how wonderfully alike is human nature under all external changes. So Wallace really saw them as having, a real kinship. And I also, that little phrase about how wonderfully alike is human nature under all external changes, that's one of Wallace's big points, which I'll come to in a few minutes. Okay, I can't speak for their childhoods, but as adults, both Wallace and Kropotkin worked in practical capacity and had extended fieldwork experience. Wallace worked as a collector in the tropics, first in Amazonia and later in the Malay Archipelago for many years because he was poor. Wallace's experience as a collector will actually be the subject of Professor Barry's talk in a couple of weeks, so I'm sure he knows lots about it that I don't, so I'm not going to say too much about that. Kropotkin, for his part, actually asked as a young man, so asked to be sent to Siberia. This was usually reserved as a punishment. But he asked to be sent to Siberia instead of taking up the cushy czarist post for which he was being groomed as a very capable Russian aristocrat. In both of their cases, this empirical fieldwork experience informed their understandings of evolution in profound ways. So the case of Wallace is better known and is going to be treated all month long, so I'm not going to go on about Wallace's experience in the field at length. But I think Kropotkin's might particularly interest us, especially here in Edmonton, since we know something about Siberian climates. And in what I'm about to say, I'm drawing on two books which I really highly recommend. One, someone named Leigh-Allen Dugotkin has recently published a book about Kropotkin called The Prince of Evolution. It's really short and nicely written and fun to read. And there's a lovely article from, 20 years ago now, by Stephen Jay Gould called Kropotkin Was No Crackpot. It's also a very nice article. So Kropotkin accompanied, he asked to be, he graduated from a military academy, he graduated at the top of his class, he was an aristocrat, he was pretty much poised to write his own ticket and probably become part of the Tsar's household. He already knew he was not interested in that life. So this is when he asked to be sent to Siberia. He did various kinds of work there, but one of the things he did is he joined a geological survey. And he actually ended up publishing on glaciation. But what he observed about both animal and human existence in Siberia convinced him that mutual aid and cooperation were key to evolutionary processes, and that it was a serious mistake to ignore this in favor of competition. His field observations convinced him that the major dynamic was not organism versus organism or species versus species, but living creatures versus a harsh environment. And he observed this in both animals and people, the way that people, in order to survive and flourish in these harsh climates, the way they relied on mutual aid and cooperation. So he thought of these as imperative adaptive strategies, and he went on and wrote about this quite a bit. I just, as a little aside, Canadiana aside, also having to do with Kropotkin, in his later life, he traveled the world as a speaker for anarchism, and he visited Canada in 1897, and he was really, really impressed by the Mennonites when he came to Canada, and he became instrumental in settling the Doukhobors in Western Canada, because he thought, okay, what works for the Mennonites, I think will work for you all, so he helped arrange for the Doukhobors to come to Canada, so that's just a little bit of Canadiana. It also happens to interest me because where I work, I'm just going to skip past this, where I work in Bolivia and Paraguay, I work with indigenous communities, but there are actually traditional Mennonite settlements there that have been there since the 1930s, and I was looking for pictures of Mennonites online, and I saw these, and I thought, oh, this must be, like, this has to be the Bolivia or Paraguay. It turns out that one is, it's not Manitoba, I think it's somewhere in Ontario, and this one is Mexico, but it's funny how the Mennonite way of life, just wherever they go, they're like, build your house like this, furniture feels like this could easily be Bolivia or Paraguay. But anyway, the interactions between, where I work, the interactions between indigenous people and Mennonites are quite fascinating. Okay, so I'm just closing that little snippet of Canadiana about Kropotkin. At the end of his life, these notions about mutual aid and their role in mutual aid and cooperation, their role in evolution, he was developing his ideas into an evolutionary theory of human ethics. And one of his major pieces of political scientific writing was mutual aid, a factor of evolution. Now, as many of you may know, for a long time, this was treated as kind of a sort of weird blind alley in the development of evolutionary theory. But interestingly enough, interest in altruism, theories of coevolution, are now really at the cutting edge of biology, and particularly in the field of evolutionary developmental biology. At the same time, anarchism as a political philosophy is all over contemporary political activism. So that's the kind of thing I mean when I say they're sort of time travelers. But let me return to these parallels I'm drawing between Wallace and Kropotkin. Okay, so I do want to, this is totally not serious, but I just don't want you to be bored. This isn't the kind of thing that Kropotkin meant, but and he didn't use the phrase interspecies snorgling. That actually comes from the website Cute Overload. But I do think this is the idea of like, things being cooperative or age and usually I think this is a cute photo. Okay, so, and I have to have something else while I'm talking. Okay, going back to parallels between Wallace and Kropotkin. Both men were really strikingly intrepid. Wallace traveled lightly and tirelessly in the tropics, first in the Amazon with his friend Gates, and also with Wallace took a younger brother with him to the Amazon who died there. Then he went on to work in the Malay archipelago after all of his collections that he had gathered in the Amazon all burned in a ship fire and sort of went down, I think, like a kilometer off the coast of South America, so they never made it back to England. So then he had to start all over again, so he went to the Malay archipelago. But actually this also contributed to his development of evolutionary theory because he saw the kind of similarities between forms of life in both areas of the tropics. Anyway, in the Malay archipelago, he traveled with what he called my faithful Malay boy, Ali. Now, Ali was a grown-up, he was not a boy. But nevertheless, so I don't want to give Wallace too much credit, nevertheless, Wallace put Ali's picture in his published version of the Malay archipelago. He talked about Ali's contributions to the scientific work. This is so unusual for someone at the time, when these stories of white exploits out in the colonies completely erased the help and participation of any local people. So, okay, no points for calling him my faithful Malay boy, but lots of points for acknowledging that he was there and including his picture in his subsequent publications. Okay, that's Wallace. To the intrepidness of Kropotkin. In addition to his time in Siberia, Kropotkin made, and I can't tell you about it at length, but if you read Leonard Dugotkin's book, it's actually really worth reading about. He made this amazingly dashing escape from a Russian prison in which he had spent 2 years. So he asked to be sent to Siberia, but eventually his real distaste for the Russian feudal state into which he was born kind of caught up with him, and he got into real trouble with the authorities. Interestingly enough, while he was in that Russian prison for 2 years, the brother of the Tsar came to visit him, mostly because he found Kropotkin so puzzling. He just thought, you had everything, What are you doing in Peter and Paul Fortress? And apparently the conversation really didn't go anywhere, and Kropotkin remained in prison until he escaped. Okay, and later in his life, when he had gone into exile, he spent another 3 years in prison in France. So these were people who were really out in the world in a courageous way. Both men, interestingly enough, married late. Wallace was 43 and Kropotkin was relatively late, 37, to considerably younger women. Wallace's wife was 25 years younger, Kropotkin's wife was 14 years younger, and in each case, both of these women had professional interests of their own. Both men had small families. Wallace had 3 children, Kropotkin had only 1 child, and both lived, I would say, fairly long lives. Wallace lived to be 90, and Kropotkin lived to 79. So make of that what you will. I just think it's interesting that so many parallels can be drawn. Both men, Wallace and Kropotkin, were remarkably supportive by the lights of the time of women's rights. I don't want to overcredit them with anti-racism, particularly because I just don't know, in Kropotkin's case, where he stood on race issues. Wallace's relationship to race I actually think is very, very interesting. So Wallace really advocated something that has become known in anthropology across the 20th century as the psychic unity of humankind. This actually posed a huge and interesting problem for Wallace. Why is it that all human beings are so much smarter than they need to be? Wallace thought this was a really interesting puzzle. But he wasn't, I don't want to overdraw him as an anti-racist. There's a really funny passage where he's in Malaysia, and he's talking about the floral and the faunal differences between the across the Wallace lines. So up to here you have sort of the people are Malay people, and then you have Papuan people, and he's describing also the differences in character. So he talks about how Malay people are very reserved and conservative and non-excitable, and Papuans are exuberant. And the phrase that he uses that has stuck with me is he said, if you've ever seen Irishmen at a fair, that'll give you a sense of what Papuans are like. So I don't know if by our contemporary lights, would that be perfect anti-racism? I'm not sure, but probably better than a lot of what was going on in the 19th century. Both Wallace and Kropotkin were actively opposed to imperialism and colonialism. Both were very interested in the idea that what were called at the time non-civilized peoples had important general lessons for human nature. Kropotkin was really interested in these examples of, again, mutual aid and cooperation in human societies outside of Europe. Wallace, again, was really interested in the non-utilitarian supercapacity of the human brain. Both men were famously humble and kindly and not attached to ceremony. Kropotkin renounced princely privilege. Wallace was an autodidact who really deferred to Darwin, and it seems to be genuinely without resentment. Perhaps what they shared above all was an admirable disregard for what other people thought. Kropotkin, who had this conversation with the brother of the Tsar and just really couldn't explain himself because the brother Tsar couldn't wrap his head around what it was that Kropotkin was up to, and Kropotkin really chose to spend his life as an embattled anarchist. Wallace allowed Darwin to have much of the worldly praise that may in fact ought to have belonged to him. And Wallace in particular continued to say exactly what he thought about a huge range of topics: anti-vaccination, land nationalization, spiritualism, extraterrestrials that Robert will talk about next time, despite a barrage of pleas from more cautious friends and colleagues who urged him to please be a bit more conventional. So I think it's worth noting also at this juncture what sympathetic characters they are for 21st century observers. Maybe we can look a bit askance at Wallace and Kropotkin's much younger wives, but other than that, I think it's really easy for someone like me to imagine with delight spending an afternoon with Wallace or Kropotkin, where it gives me just this really itchy, the idea of spending a day with Darwin or Marx does not appeal to me at all. I don't know, and the question of does this kind of thing matter to the history of ideas? I really think that the feminist slogan, the personal is political, I think it's really true. And so I think this kind of thing does matter to the history idea. It's maybe not the main thing that matters, but I think it's worth paying attention to. Okay. Wallace and Kropotkin, of course, had their admirers at the time. But they didn't end up having the most influential admirers. They got folded, as I already mentioned, into Darwinism and into Marxism over their own kind of gentle demurrals. In both cases, and true to their natures, their impulses to be collaborative actually helped the process along by which they got folded into Darwinism and Marxism. Wallace argued with Darwin about competition and about sexual selection in particular. Based on his vast practical experience, I don't have a great image to, this is Birds of Paradise, one of the things that Wallace was interested in collecting. Based on his vast practical field experience, Wallace suggested that secondary sexual differentiation was a means of mutually facilitating mating opportunities rather than a manifestation of competitive strategies toward reproduction. This, in a way, anticipated contemporary ideas in evolutionary developmental biology about sexual reproduction being about equipping offspring with very genetic resources on which to draw under uncertain external conditions. And of course, the social implications of sexual variety being about providing opportunities for cooperation rather than being outcomes of and stratagems for battle. I mean, obviously, those are friendlier implications. Nevertheless, for all his arguments with Darwin, Wallace was one of Darwin's most tireless promoters. Kropotkin, turning back to Kropotkin, for his part, he, as I said before, thought the Bolsheviks took the revolution in the wrong direction, but nevertheless, he wanted to support that revolution. He moved back to Russia as quite an old man in 1917, and in one of his last letters, and here I'm quoting, Kropotkin said, "The social revolution has involuntarily taken a centralist and authoritarian turn in Russia. Still, it presents the possibility of a transition from capitalist society to socialist society. And this thought will certainly encourage the socialists of Western Europe in their efforts to reconstruct society on the basis of anti-capitalist equality. In addition, beyond all doubt, the centralist faults of the Russian Communist Revolution will assist the workers of other countries to avoid similar mistakes." So I think, I'm always hoping for the best, you know, it's kind of a nice aspect of their characters. Okay. Wallace's and Kropotkin's version of how things are, why things are the way they are, were in a sense put in cold storage across the 20th century rather than really being put forthrightly to rest. Much of the 20th century take on both of them was condescending rather than confrontational. Something that, just to bring it up again, something that feminists know something about. When Gold wrote his article, Kropotkin was no crackpot, I mean, the reason he felt like he had to call his article Kropotkin was no crackpot is because that was one of the takes on Kropotkin's notions of evolution. Certainly Wallace has been kind of relentlessly subjected to this treatment as the guy who, sure, he had some good ideas about evolution, but he went on this wacky spiritualist bent and, you know, then was off at the races. Okay, anyone who has even the faintest interest in the history of science or any experience with social interaction knows very well that treating some set of ideas is not even worth addressing, if it works, is a way of making sure that they aren't thought about without putting any effort into actually falsifying them. Now, turning to the case of Kropotkin, you can also just kill people, send them into the gulag, send them off into exile, which is actually what happened to many anarchists. Kropotkin, he dies in 1921 or 1922, I can't remember. But anyway, so Kropotkin, and everybody knows that Kropotkin has a lot of support. So he's sort of quietly sent off to live in a dacha somewhere. When he makes complaints about how the revolution's going, they say, "Oh yes, we're taking careful notes. We really respect your opinion." When he dies, he has this massive publicly celebrated funeral. The anarchists are allowed to march in the funeral. That is the last public appearance of anarchists in Soviet Russia. Shortly afterwards, the crackdown really becomes quite dire. Okay, so there are multiple methods to get rid of inconvenient notions, all of which saw plenty of action during the 20th century. Okay, so I don't want to talk on and on forever, and you may think that it also looks a bit suspicious that I promised you that I'm going to have these interesting things to say about anti-utilitarianism, and then I'm suddenly saying, "Oh, but I know town," so I can't really explain to you what I mean. But I do want to open it up to conversation. But I think that the Wallace's and Kropotkin's shared convictions about Anti-utilitarianism, when crafting accounts of the human story from its evolutionary origin to its possible futures, is tremendously interesting, and I don't feel that I'm alone. I mean, I think there's really a reason that that Wallace and Kropotkin are coming in for renewed attention now. So in hope of starting conversation, here, okay, I didn't get to this. I will talk about this a little bit. So for those of you who don't know, one of the reasons that Wallace became so interested in spiritualism, well, there's probably many personal reasons he became interested in spiritualism towards the end of his life, but having worked on evolution throughout his life, he really found the human mind posed a tremendous problem for his understanding of evolution, because he thought, if evolution is in some way constraint-driven, that part of what evolution does is we adapt to constraints. How can you explain the human brain, which is so in excess of any reasonable need, and not just any? And he was really interested in this being the case everywhere. So he talked about, if you look at the material level of life, people in, for example, Papua New Guinea, they don't need to be as smart as they are. They really could get along and survive in their circumstances, being much less intelligent, being much less creative. So he paid particular attention. So this is something that appeared in the Malay Archipelago. I don't know exactly what this is. I don't know exactly what it's from. It's someplace in the island of Papua New Guinea. He was really interested in the beauty of the design, and he talked about this a lot. That he said, if you really, how can you can't say that these people have. First, you can't say that they really have primitive mentalities, that their eye for design would compare very well to anything we see in Europe. So this is actually from the Malay part of the Malay Archipelago, so this is a kind of house. But he was interested in, very interested in fact, in the aesthetic sense, that he felt like was, if you think in terms of utility and need, the aesthetic sense of humans is so excessive. Now, and is universal. You see it everywhere that you see human beings. So anthropologists talk about this, of course, under the heading of culture, and we're interested in what he paid attention to in terms of aesthetics. We think of as sort of cultural creativity in general. This is one of the marks, one of the hallmarks of the psychic unity of mankind, humanity, to be more up to date. So, and Wallace thought the evolution, as I understand it, can't explain this. The answer he then went to was, so there must be some kind of divine force at work. This is where his interest in spiritualism comes from. That the only way you could explain this kind of incredible surplus of mental capacity, this interest in aesthetics, there has to be some kind of divine or supernatural force in the world. I don't think that we have to accept Wallace's answer to say that actually that remains a really, really interesting question. I think it remains a tremendously interesting question. Okay, so to begin conversation, although you may want to take up all kinds of other things, I want to bring in a third term, and I'm going to invoke something that Oscar Wilde says. And Oscar Wilde, it turns out, was a great admirer of Kropotkin, and I also know that Wallace liked Oscar Wilde. He quoted one of Wilde's poems in his book, The Wonderful Centuries. So I can at least make some kind of commonality among them. But Wilde had this lovely phrase, all art is quite useless. I really love this phrase. I love the kind of old 19th century feeling of possibility that it generates. And I think the reason that there's this renewed interest in Wallace and Kropotkin is because they suggest the possibility of imagining a science, a politics, and an ethics of excess and, in a sense, uselessness in the sense that Wilde means it, rather than scarcity and utility, of anarchism rather than things like leadership, whether of the czars or of the masses, of cooperation rather than competition. So the question is, might all of this in the 21st century finally come into its own? I don't think it's an accident that Wallace is getting centenaries not just here, but lots of places, that students are asking to be taught Kropotkin, that women and the less favored races have kind of joined the party, that gay men like Wilde no longer living in the love that dare not speak its name. I don't think we have a good answer to Wallace's questions about the glorious excess of the human brain. I also wanted to note Kropotkin, it's not so much that he talks about excess, but his idea about, these ideas about mutual aid and sympathetic giving towards others. He says at one point that if we lived in a society of perfect equity, society would die from it. And I think what he means by that is you always have to give kind of a little more. There's always circumstances in which, and there's always circumstances in which you've received more than you've given, and there's other circumstances in which you have to give more than you've gotten, and that's really important for thinking about both a perfect social future, but also what the human story has looked like in evolutionary terms. Okay, so I hope we can embrace excess as a core value for our collective future. So I could say more about all of this, but I also did want to have a chance to talk, maybe to be wildly criticized, which is fine. I can take it. But anyway, so now it's your turn to talk, and in the coming weeks it's going to be others' turns to talk about Wallace. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for